Hello you, welcome to Silverets and welcome back to Planet Zoo. Now today is all about the Indian elephant and I'll be building a separate habitat for them. Again, perhaps this will be my last separate habitat build. We'll see if I feel ready to tackle a full zoo after this, but many comments have been asking me recently if I'm ever gonna actually start a zoo, and I have to say yes, eventually I would like to do this. But for now, this is a very different new experience for me, this is a very new game, and I want to really experiment as much as I can before I move into a full zoo, so I hope you understand that. But yeah, back to the topic at hand. I was inspired to start a Thai build, not just because I'm interested in the architecture and the whole theme of it, but also just because these strange events that have been happening over the last few weeks. Basically, my audience on this platform has completely shifted. Some of the biggest countries for me in terms of audience always used to be the United States, Germany and the United Kingdom, with the Netherlands sometimes on a 4th or 3rd position. But recently, suddenly Thailand skyrocketed and became the 2nd biggest group in my demographic. At least according to view counts. It's nowhere near that in subscribers because it's really just due to recent attention. But basically what happened is there's a Thai YouTuber which started making videos on Planet Coaster and Planet Zoo called Heartrocker, and who has created a lot of buzz for these games in Thailand. And this difference is really substantial. I've heard from some inside sources that apparently the sales figures for Planet Coaster have increased by 50% over the last few weeks, which is absolutely insane. And this happened even before Planet Zoo came out. And the same kind of goes for Planet Zoo, I suppose, because Heartrocker's also been making a lot of videos on this. But for me, personally, there's another reason, which is a much bigger reason for my Thai audience. But I think this is probably related to the skyrocketing popularity of these games in Thailand, and that is that a tweet went viral about my Volvara build in Planet Coaster and got like 60,000 retweets on Twitter and just sort of became this viral Thai tweet that also drew a lot of attention to the games and to my channel in particular. So yeah, this has been a really cool happening and it's been really interesting to see so much attention to these games also coming from a country and a region in the world that otherwise I don't see reflected in the community as much overall. These kinds of games have always seemed very sort of Northwestern Europe and US centric, especially the Netherlands for some reason, I'm not sure, but there are just such huge parts of the community of these creative simulation games that are always Dutch, and I really don't know why, because there are only about 17 million Dutch people in this world, which is quite a few, but it's way fewer than the UK and US, and despite this they often have almost just as large audiences in these kinds of games. But yeah, that's way off topic. I just found it really interesting that there's sort of this large new audience from a different part of the world coming to this, and I guess I am just trying to play to my audience with this in a sense and try and tackle a Thai theme as well, which is either a great idea or a terrible idea, given that people are probably going to be able to bust my nuts about this, given that I'm not going to be building anywhere near as properly Thai themed as people from this part of the world could probably do. I might be inviting some heavy critics here, but I love Thai architecture, just all the different styles of Asian architecture in general. And a long time ago in Planet Coaster, me and Rudy Renkamel made Garuda, which was a Thai-themed RMC roller coaster. And after that, I always just thought it was one of my favorite themes that I'd ever done, especially with the focus on these pointed roofs and all of the detailing around it. So I always wanted to do it again, and right about now seems like a good time to try it. Also given the fact that I'm still doing, you know, standalone habitats and I can just mess about with the game and experiment. Now let me finally talk about what I'm actually doing here. So right now I'm working on a building which is heavily inspired by Buddhist temples in Thailand, which is a theme that I'm going to be following for much of the rest of this habitat as well. And the idea for this building was to make it the main viewing shelter. I was inspired by these pavilions that you'll often find in temple complexes called a sala. I don't know exactly how to pronounce Thai words, so I'm probably going to be putting emphases wrong and things like these on words. But yeah, it's this kind of open pavilion style building which you'll often find in temple complexes in Thailand, which traditionally supposedly were used to let travelers rest and things like this, and which I think provide a really cool structure to create a guest viewing platform out of for habitats, because very often in zoo habitats, especially for the sort of charismatic megafauna, you'll have some kind of shelters for guests to view the animals from, and I figured if I'm gonna try and go with a very heavily themed habitat, I want to, as always, keep the theming and the architecture really restricted to the guests' side of things, and basically making a sort of open temple viewing shelter structure seems like a good idea in that sense. Now, I have to say, I was struggling a lot with making this, because I was mostly basing this on a pavilion in the Albridge Botanical Gardens in Madison, although with different colors and details based on what's available in the game. But it turned out to be really quite a struggle, because for one, I need to make all of the roof pieces completely custom, because the game doesn't have these pointy, curved roof pieces that I'm looking for this theme. You know, even though there's an East Asian theme, this is really typically Japanese and Chinese elements, and very few of that set I think could be used to build Southeast Asian theme, specifically Thai architecture. So I have to make a lot myself here, and this is not necessarily an issue. I think there are a fair amount of pieces that you can use to make custom roofs out of. In this case, I ended up using the wooden beams, the small 1 meter versions from the East Asian pack, to make custom roof shingles and sort of curve these upwards to make these typical Thai curved pointed roofs, which worked alright. But it did mean that this building contains thousands of pieces. It's somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 pieces by the time that I'm done. And I wasn't really expecting this to be that much of an issue. I've done this sort of thing many times in Planet Coaster and gotten away with it. But for some reason, Planet Zoo started really struggling with this. And before I complain too much about this, I have to admit this is not the kind of thing that developers want you to do. I'm sure that if anybody who worked on the programming of this game is seeing me do this, they're cringing really hard, because it's just way too taxing on the game itself. But yeah, I want to have my Thai roofs, and I'm gonna get them one way or another. But yeah, this game just started struggling with this a lot, and the game started freezing many times, especially whenever I was building around the roof. I would get these 20 to 30 second freezes when I was placing or removing something, and this made it a really time consuming sort of effort to build this building. And you can see some of these freezes happening on the time lapse every now and then, I suppose. This is sped up about 12 times, so hopefully they won't be much more than just a sort of infrequent jitter of frame rate. But yeah, just so you know, that is a reason why every now and then the time-lapse, despite being a time-lapse, might not be that smooth in terms of frame rate, and also why I just took so long to build this building and some of the other stuff around this habitat as well, because it's just really difficult to work with this. And I don't want to attack the game for this, because it's really not what you're supposed to do, or at least I cannot demand from the developers that they can make the game support this kind of ridiculous building behavior. But it was kind of a bummer, and it made building this whole structure a little bit annoying. I also have to say, there were a bunch of other grievances that have since been patched out. So for example, the X button kept crashing on me, and I would have to move stuff with the mouse basically, and using the 3D gizmo like that, which is a little bit annoying, but that bug has been patched out since in the last update. It's just that this footage is already kind of old, so it's still made with the first version of the game, or the second update, which still had a bunch of bugs in it. And then also the recoloring options in the game were still problematic because you couldn't recolor multiple objects at the same time. I did find a workaround for this. I would typically just take a bunch of objects that I wanted to recolor out of a building, make them a separate scenery group, and then just recolor that scenery group, and then afterwards reintegrate them into the building. So there were some workarounds for some of this, but I was kind of struggling with these kind of things, and because of that I think I wasn't building as efficiently as I could have otherwise done. Hence why this is also a 30-minute video, so I hope you guys are sitting comfortably and got something to eat, got something to snack maybe. Maybe you're doing something else and you're just checking back on the time-lapse every now and then, just listening to me talk on and on about Thai roof structures. That's also fine, but yeah, just this is kind of my explanation for why this is a very long-winded video. Now, I'll come back to the viewing shelter later. It's actually a little bit unfinished as of now. I still want to add some detailing to it later, and I want to add a spire on top of it. So it's not exactly what I was looking for, but at this point I felt like I was done working on this thing because it's been about 2 hours of just working on that roof. So I just wanted to move on to some other things and actually give this building a context, finish some of the surrounding area as well. So here's the connection to the path. It is actually going to be functional, so people are going to be able to walk up the stairs and go into the building. I did work out a different sort of path grid system within the building so that people wouldn't walk into the pillars. Because if the whole building were just one big plaza and I put the pillars in the middle of it, you would sometimes catch some people, walking through the pillars, which is something that I didn't want to have. So what I ended up doing is just building every path on a 4-meter grid, and having these little paths going between the pillars, and then covering all of that up later with regular flat roof pieces, so that the texture that you see is actually a roof piece, and underneath that will be these different pathwork paths that people can walk through, so that they take some pretty sort of predetermined paths through the building that don't cross through the pillars. Which sometimes is a neat workaround if you're trying to make, a very wide area seem like it's one path or one plaza, but you don't want people to walk through everything like people will in this game. If you just put scenery on the path, then doing something like that and covering the paths up, I think can work. Now, speaking of the path system, I was kind of struggling here to make this next structure that I wanted to build. My idea for this was I wanted to build a small viewing platform that would be raised and almost in the middle of the habitat, if you will, so that you could take a bridge to it, and once you're in this viewing platform, you have almost a 360-degree view of the elephant exhibit, because that would be right underneath the path here. So it's a little bit more immersive than just standing at a distance and looking at the elephants far away in one direction, but you can actually have elephants in different directions around this platform, which I thought would be a slightly more interesting way to interact with them, and also a way to give the guests different ways to view the elephants from. So I thought that would be nice to add. Then over here on this side, with this retaining wall kind of structure made out of the habitat boundaries, is more of a sort of standard viewing area for the habitat. Just a path at a distance, kind of raised, to prevent the elephants from getting out, of course. But yeah, that's a much more simple way of tackling the issue of how guests can actually view the animals, I suppose. Now, this structure was inspired by a different element in Taiwanese. Did I just say Taiwanese? In Thai temples, which is, well, according from my research at least, something called a kuti, which is a traditional living space for monks on temple grounds or near temple grounds, which are often small wooden buildings on stilts. Nowadays, apparently, they are more often just simple apartment building complexes or things like this. But referring to the sort of traditional inspiration, I found that a lot of these temple complexes have these small buildings on stilts, and I figured I can't really exactly copy this style, but something invoking the same kind of typology could work out very well for this raised viewing shelter. So that's what I decided to go for. Now, because this is a little bit less of a fancy building, I'm also going with slightly different textures. It's made out of wood mostly, instead of the very fancy, probably marble in real life parts of the larger shelter. And also the overall colors are a bit more diminished and dark and gritty. So you can also tell that from the wooden shingles that I'm making here. Now, what I also wanted to experiment with a bit more, and this is, I think, you know, besides the shape, one of the biggest advantages of making custom roofs, you can actually have some variation in the texture. So of course you can make custom roofs if you want to go for a certain shape, like the pointed roof, which I'm doing here because there's not one in game. But you can also click on different objects that you've made the roof out of and give them different colors or different positions or shapes to slightly change the texture, because you really get this sort of three-dimensional texture on this, because of course every single tile is really a separate object, which from a game perspective is a terrible idea, and you should never do this because it's just way too hard on the processing power of your computer and it's just gonna screw up a lot of players of the game. But since it's just me and I don't have to answer for the performance of the game, I can make this roof out of separate pieces. And as you can see, I'm making the tiles or the shingles here gradually darker toward the top, just as a sort of weathering effect, which I think is one of these touches that is one of the reasons why you would potentially want to make a roof custom, just to provide that little bit of variation. It's a really small thing, but I think it makes a huge difference, even if just because I wanted to build this building to seem a bit more old and to seem a little bit more dilapidated, and it's slightly less of a fancy structure than the main viewing shelter. Hence I'm also completely rebuilding this pointy roof because it is slightly different than the other one, and I'm using different pieces for this one. These are, I believe, small plank pieces, which in hindsight I do think are a little bit better because they're flat instead of the very thick large wooden beam pieces that I made the roof of the main viewing shelter out of, so that works a bit better in this situation. But yeah, aside from that, it's a very similar strategy, just layering these things in the shape of a pointed roof until you pretty much have a roof structure. Now, as a tip for people who want to make these kind of roofs themselves, you've probably seen me just use an in-game roof as a guide, and I would highly recommend just doing that because it's a great guide to see how large a full tile is, because ideally you would like to make these custom roofs, you know, exactly fit on a full tile so that you can repeat them and connect them together. And it also just helps to keep them on a grid as well, because if you don't have at least one part of this roof that also is restricted to the grid in the game, it's going to be very difficult to copy these roofs around and make them seamlessly connect to each other, since if you don't have a grid piece, they just kind of loosely float in the game. So I feel like these are some important pointers to keep in mind when you're building custom roofs. But yeah, that's it for the roof structure of this building. It's much simpler than the other building I built, and to be honest, after that whole experience of trying to make the main viewing shelter, I really didn't want to bother too much with this one and keep it all a bit more simple. Now, with that said, and God, we're nearly 20 minutes into this video and I've barely even worked on the habitat itself. So with that said, I'm actually starting to work on the habitat here. And my idea for this originally was mostly inspired by the elephant yard in Cincinnati Zoo. Is that actually how you pronounce that city? Maybe I messed it up. Maybe I did. Either way, it was inspired by that, which I found some interesting plans for. So this is mostly the sort of makeup of the paths and the location of the viewing shelters. But then I used the Chester Zoo Indian Elephant exhibit on Zoolex as a reference along the way, mostly because there's a lot of information on Zoolex about this exhibit, and it was just something to keep in the background while I was working on this and to constantly refer to as a reference for whatever I was building, to make sure that it would actually be a logical thing to do. Partly because Chester Zoo is just really such a well-known and recognized zoo in Europe, Fun fact actually, and I don't even know where I learned this from, but Chester Zoo was apparently the main inspiration for the developers of Planet Zoo as well, and the main zoo that they constantly looked at when they were thinking about adding something into the game, and they constantly looked for a source of inspiration. So I thought that was really interesting, but honestly quite understandable, because as far as I know, Chester Zoo is one of, if not the best zoo in Europe. So definitely something to keep in mind. And there's a lot of information about it on Zoolex as well. And I've already advertised Zoolex a bit before, but it's just this really good website with information and pictures about a wide variety of zoo habitats, which is super useful. And I have to give a shout out to Nutria Hirsch on Twitter for sending me this link to Zoolex a long time ago, and I believe he also tagged a bunch of other people like Geekism in this, because it really helped out a lot ever since. Hell, I actually have to give him props also for just giving me a lot of information on Twitter in general. He works at a zoo in Germany somewhere, and he's just been chatting to me a lot about, you know, giving tips on the game and how to build realistic habitats, which I have to be honest, I'm a total noob, so I need this kind of thing because I might know a bit or two about architecture and landscaping, but when it comes to animal welfare, that's my main weak point, and conversely the thing that you should probably pay most attention to when you're trying to make a zoo. So I'm really glad that he's being so helpful. And again, I guess like I always say, if there's anything that you think I did wrong or that I could improve, please let me know. Just be as harsh as you can, because that's the only way that I can really improve my game. Now, he did mention a couple of things that I'm gonna say right now are completely wrong about this habitat that I built here, because I built this habitat before I started chatting with him recently, and some notes that he gave me are that elephants eat absolutely every green thing they can find in their reach. And I ended up putting a lot of trees, a lot of very lively trees and bushes as well in this habitat, which realistically probably doesn't make that much sense, because by the time the elephants are done with it, they should be dead. But I guess we'll just assume that this habitat is brand new. It's all still very alive, and it's all still very much like the renders of architects intended. Speaking of which, I'm not surprised that a lot of architecture firms work on habitats in zoo as well, and their zoo habitat renders are just as fancy and over the top as real building renders. This is really, you know, architectural renders are always kind of like the pictures in fast food joints where you see a beautiful hamburger on the screen and then you get it and it's just a piece of garbage. That's basically what a lot of architectural renders do as well, and I feel like for zoos they do pretty much the same kind of thing, and I don't know, I always thought that was interesting. Obviously they want to sell the thing that they've designed, and renders are always kind of a sort of utopian vision of real life, but it's just this kind of funny thing that translates almost perfectly from the architectural world into the world of designing zoos as well, it seems. But yeah, what was I even talking about before that? I guess my sort of bridge here is that, yeah, this habitat is brand new, and it's still kind of like it would be represented on an architectural render, with a lot of greenery and foliage that realistically is a little bit over the top. Not to mention that the architecture, especially the main viewing shelter, is a little bit over the top as well, even if zoos in real life do commonly have this kind of grandiose, detailed architecture as well. Now, Nutria did give me the tip of working on subtle ways to keep animals in certain places, not just within their habitats, but also to keep them away from trees and things like this in their habitats, to use hot wires or untraversable rock elements on the ground to stop them, which is something that I'm definitely gonna want to try in the future, but I have to say, in this game I don't think it's gonna make much of a difference. In real life you can put small rocks and pebbles on the ground to make certain barriers for animals that they don't want to step on, but in Planet Zoo I think they are gonna walk on pretty much anything solid, so we'll see. Something to experiment with in the future, just to see how you can make more subtle and invisible barriers and divisions of habitats. Speaking of which, and this is something which I can't believe I haven't said yet, but this isn't just one habitat. In game, this whole area is actually made up of 2 habitats, and if you were a viewer who pays attention, you might have noticed that I put a fence in the middle of the water, somewhere to the side of this habitat. And the idea behind this was to basically just have one main area where I would put the whole bunch of elephants, and then also a separate bull yard. If I ever needed to, you know, have some elephants separate, especially some guys, then I can dump them in there. So just realistically speaking, being able to keep animals in separate habitats and having these kind of bull yards and things are something that you necessarily see in zoos. So something that I wanted to include here, even if it's just a bit basic, because I don't really have a backyard or a backstage yard away from guests where I could keep elephants separate as well, which realistically I could have tried to include as well. But just in this case, I wanted to try and make this sort of large area, which seems like one habitat, and where guests can see all of the elephants, but where in reality I can separate some of them. And here I'm just working on a waterfall. And I know how I've complained about YouTubers building waterfalls in every exhibit before on social media, if not in my videos as well. I can't really remember. When it comes to elephants, I really wanted to have a waterfall, because these things are such a staple of elephant habitats. They're also really important just because elephants really need to be near water, and they need to have a large amount of water in their exhibits in real zoos as well. So it's nice to have this water element also, and I think it works quite well with the main viewing temple building. It's just kind of this scene which I set up. Obviously the waterfall is also partly an element of decoration for the guests to look at. Even if elephants couldn't care less how nice the rockwork is or how beautiful the foliage looks together, it's something that just for guest reasons I'd want to keep in mind as well. And here I'm putting a bunch of dead trees, which in hindsight is a bit more realistic than the actual alive trees which I put in the rest of the habitats, because realistically this is what the trees are gonna look like. But no, I just figured that it would look good in this area because I wanted to put something there, but I didn't want to obstruct the rest of the view of the habitat. So that's why it works to have some dead trees in a habitat as well. But of course, realistically, it also works out because it's some form of scenery and some form of nature, but at the same time, the animals can't really destroy it much or anything like that. So I suppose this is also why you'll find a lot of dead trees in zoo exhibits as well. So this is almost the end of the time lapse. There's just one more thing that I needed to do before this habitat was finished, and that is at the final spire on top of the main viewing building. Now, I actually tried looking up what some of the names of the different elements are of traditional Thai temple architecture, and there are definitely some interesting elements. You've got chofa, which are the pointed ends of the roof, which are decorations that I'll add off camera at some point as well to finish the main buildings. And lamyong, which are apparently the name of the decorative structures at the end of the gables of the roof, which are really cool and really a sort of characteristic element of these Thai temples. And I really love decorated gables. I'm also a big fan of them in Swiss chalet architecture and things like this. But I couldn't really find the specific name for these sort of rounded pointed spires in the middle of temples. So if anybody knows of this, please let me know, because it's been on my mind for a while and I couldn't really find it. But in any case, this structure on top of the building is based on these rounded spires that you'll often find on temples as well. And with that, I would like to finish this episode. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll leave you with some cinematic views of the elephants enjoying their new habitats. And for the record, before I forget to mention this as well, I didn't record any stats, but as far as I've been able to tell, the stats on the elephants are fine and they're all green, and they're somehow even happy with the foliage, which is mostly wrong. Not entirely happy, but decent enough, I think. Anyway, bye guys.